true. So this is another way of looking at the problem, just the odds of exceeding some critical thresholds. So if we don't take any policy, then, in all cases we're above 4 degrees. If we, and we have a good chance of being above 6 degrees, more than a 1 in 4, about a 1 in 4 chance. Even if we do this relatively modest policy level 4, which is trying to keep emissions below 750 parts per million, that reduces this chance of greater than 6 degrees quite a lot. Level 1, it takes level 1 to stay below, give a 1 in 4 chance of less than 2 degrees from present. So this is a kind of a way of looking at the risk. One of the things we point out is that, again, you can focus on these very tight policies, and that's been the European objective, and maybe we want to get that. But even if we don't achieve that, getting even some of these looser policies really cuts off some of the worst possibilities. So, we shouldn't, if we can't get the absolute best policy, we shouldn't throw in the towel and give up. Getting at least something done will keep us, will help a lot. This is an estimate of how the cost of the policy. So we think the Stern estimates of how much this would cost were just a bit too low. We're seeing that in order to kind of get this level 1 policy, which is 450, is actually going to almost certainly cost less than 1% of world GDP. It's a good chance that it costs more than 2%, or even 3%. So it's more costly than Stern. The Stern report was estimated, but it's not going to kill us, right? So, I think that there's been a lot of. Sometimes people say, well, this won't cost anything. Don't emphasize the cost. You're going to stop action. From my standpoint, if you try to kind of pass a policy and say it's not going to cost anything, and people later find out it does, then it's going to cause backlash. So I think we have to have our eyes open that there will be an economic cost, there will be higher energy prices and other sorts of things as a result of these policies. And if we then make the choice knowing that, we're going to be prepared for it. So I think we need these realistic costs. One of the things, we mentioned this issue of how do we get other countries involved. So the way this policy has evolved is that we have these international negotiations. All of them have written language that says the developed countries, the US, Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, will do stuff. The developing countries will get incentives to do something. Essentially, they've argued that they aren't going to bear costs, that we would pick up that burden. So that adds this complication that then we in the United States and Europe would have to, if we really go ahead with that, then we would have to pay for the cost of our abating and the costs of developing countries abating as well. So that has been a big sticking point, as in, we've hardly been willing to put up the money to abate ourselves, much less pay for the rest of the world. So this has been signed into all the international treaty language. It's not clear that anyone really has understood what it's meant or what its cost is. So we've tried to come up with some estimates of what that would mean. And so we've looked at this. There is this, the G8, the big economic 8, have kind of called for 50% reduction in emissions for the world below something. They were a little bit vague about that by 2050. So we looked at suppose developed countries cut by 70%, and then in order to achieve this 50%, developing countries would only have to cut by 30%. So that looks like a way to kind of maybe share the burden in a way where we're taking a disproportionate cut. What that actually does is, here's the losses as percent of GDP essentially for different regions. That 70% cut in the US only costs us a very little. But the Middle East and Latin America, that costs 9 or 10% of their GDP. So even though they're only cutting 30%, it ends up being a bigger, much bigger cost on their economies. Why is it? Well, they're still much more dependent on energy. Their infrastructure is still being developed. They're not as wealthy, so those energy costs are a bigger share of their economy. Also, countries like the Middle East, one of the results of a policy like this is we don't consume oil. They make most of their income by selling oil. So if no one's buying it, that has an impact on their economy. So those trade effects are important. So we said, what if we had to actually make the calculation so that the developed countries fully compensated the developing countries, then we see none of those losses in developing countries, and then this is an increase in costing developed countries. How we allocated this one everywhere from as much as 7 or 8% for the former Soviet Union to just 1% for the U.S. This is in the year 2020. If we did it equal across, it's about a 2%. So this is just getting to 2020. If not to 2050, that cost actually rises to 10% for us to compensate developing countries. So one of the issues here is that while maybe this would only cost the U.S. economy 2% for us to control our own emissions, if we have to kind of pay for the rest of the world to do it, then it's going to cost us more. So that is one of the real sticking, as I mentioned earlier, one of the real sticking points as we go forward. That's the equal cost of 2050. And, you know, the net financial flows from developed to developing countries is $430 billion a year in 2020 and $3.3 trillion a year in 2050. So that's a big amount of money we're kind of moving to kind of pay for the cost. I mean, $1 trillion used to seem like $1 trillion used to seem like a lot, I guess. We're used to $1 trillion now. That's about one bailout. This is 3.3 bailouts a year. Spend a little bit of time looking just at you know, the kind of recent legislation in Congress. The Markey-Waxman bill is before the House. I think it has a target of about 83% reduction by 2005. And here, just to kind of look at that, we have a report, if you're interested, a new one, Report 173, that just looks at some of these. It's not the Markey-Waxman bill per se, but it's about the same sort of target reduction. I guess, I don't know, I was talking to Sunshine a little bit before, since you're in the press, we've been having this huge debate. The Republicans took out an early report, did some calculations and claimed we were saying that it was going to cost every family household like $3,100 per household a year. That was really a misuse of the numbers. I kind of wrote a letter to the Boehner, the House, explaining why it's wrong, but one of the Texas congressmen declared that even though I was from M.I.T, I was an NUT for claiming it was going to cost less. So that's caused a whole flap in the press trying to kind of get it straightened out. I think at this point, you know, the Republicans just aren't interested in having the right answer. They're interested in having their answer. So it's been an interesting spring to try and straighten that out, but actually not be very successful. So Washington, some of you, if you report in Washington, you know that the truth and what is helpful for you are often two different things, and so then you don't want to let the truth get in the way as you go forward. So that's been kind of an issue as we've gone ahead. But what sorts of results do we see? That yellow bar at the top, that's how we think U.S. emissions would grow if we did nothing. So they just head up. In fact, one of the phenomena we see is that some of the best, you know, energy resources, oil and gas, at least oil, is starting to deplete. And if we still, and where we would go next are things like the Canadian tar sands or shale oil or coal liquids. Those are even dirtier than oil. So one of the problems we face is that if we don't do anything, the energy system is likely to get dirtier in the future, not cleaner. So these are then the three scenarios of paths. The green one at the bottom, the dashed line, that's about where the Markey-Waxman bill is.